My name is Francesca Lamorgia, and I'm the founder and director of Mother Tongues. This is the second of 3 videos, and we're going to focus on nurturing a culturally and linguistically responsive environment. In the first video, we spoke about the child, about child language development, second language learning, and we took the perspective of the child who's growing up speaking and hearing more than one language. In today's video, we're going to focus on how you can support the development of 2 languages or more in the context of children who are learning a new language, but also in the context of children growing up bilingually from a very young age. So we'll go into some questions specific to your situation, your attitude, your experience, because I feel that some of the questions that you may have when you encounter bilingual children are very much informed by your own experience. So the first question is, did you speak 2 languages or more than 2 languages growing up? I would like you to think about this. It won't take you long to answer, of course, but also think about not only maybe the languages in your home, but the languages that you heard around you and that maybe you could speak, but you feel you couldn't speak very, very well. And again, why do you think you speak these languages to a very good extent, or, you know, with fluency or not? The second question is whether you feel that you have succeeded in learning a second language. Many of you will have had the experience of learning a second language, and that might have been in the school environment and might have been because you got immersed in a second language. And when I say second language, I mean that this language was introduced after you developed your first language. So when you're thinking about this, I know you might focus on the word success, because what is success when you're learning a language? And especially if you're learning a second language, you might already have an idea of how well you know your first language. And you would consider that quite successful, because many of us consider us good enough in the language that we've been speaking from birth. But at the same time, we often look at ourselves quite in a very negative way sometimes. We're very harsh on ourselves when we measure our success in a second language. So it's very common to hear people saying, oh, I didn't do very well in Irish, or I'm not very good at Irish. And sometimes the way people are measuring this good or not very good is based on their own perception rather than any other measure. So I think it's interesting at this point, because we're talking about language development, we're talking about how we interact with children, that we look at how we consider ourselves as language learners and as bilinguals in the case of those of you who have grown up bilingually. What's that experience been like if you have grown up speaking 2 languages? So this is another question for you to really think about. Do you feel that you have succeeded in learning a second language? And the third question is linked to this. And again, it's to think about your experience. Do you remember the experience of learning Irish or learning other languages, whether in school or in informal settings or even on a holiday? And do you see that as a positive experience? Really spend maybe a couple of minutes trying to associate all of your language learning experiences with your reaction or your feelings. Were you scared of maybe speaking in front of others, or maybe were you thinking it would be an embarrassing moment to having to speak a language in front of other, or a language that's not your native language in front of others? Or did you feel really enthusiastic about learning another language, and then maybe now you feel you wish you had more time to keep it up or to learn new languages? So again, even sometimes as adults, when we approach the idea of having to learn another language, we often go back, maybe subconsciously, to our own memory of learning a language. And then what happens in our head is that we think, oh, that was so hard, or I wish I had more time because it's so much fun. Or yes, it was hard, but it paid off. And I really enjoyed when I was able to express myself. So just have a think about what these memories and these experiences were like. This one is also a very important question. You might be wondering, well, we're talking about children, why am I looking at myself? But I think it's really important when we're dealing often with a situation that we may have lived already, but we don't acknowledge, that we remember that some of the decisions that we make and some of the advice that we give is very often informed, not so much by a textbook or by research that we've read, but how we think based on our own experience. And that's why I'm thinking it's really important that we focus initially on our own experience. So what happens or what happened in your life when you found yourself not understanding what people were saying and when no one could speak your language? Some of you might have found yourselves in a place maybe abroad. It's very, very easy compared to other languages for English speakers to be abroad and to be able to use English. And so it's quite interesting, because for a lot of people who speak English, going abroad might mean going to another English speaking country, or sometimes going to a country where at least a few people will be able to interact in your language. And so maybe few people have found themselves completely lost and not being able to understand or to even read the signs or the menus or any information around you. But if you found yourself in this situation, how did that feel? And finally, we always have an idea of how good a language is, how important a language is. And as people working with children, I would like you to think about, did you find yourself ever praising a child for their home language? For example, you can speak Spanish? Oh, that's fantastic. Or, oh, I didn't know you're also able to say this in another language. That's great. So did you ever find yourself praising a child for their home language? So I'd like you to, maybe if you haven't been in this situation, to put yourself in the situation. So I will use the only language I know I can speak very well, which is my native language. So I'm going to use a couple of sentences that I would use if I was in a context with children. Bambini, adesso prepariamoci tutti quanti che è quasi ora di pranzo, va bene? Allora, mettete via tutto quello che c'è sul tavolo e cominciate. Ok? Ok, adesso togliete tutto, benissimo. Ok, adesso ci prepariamo per il pranzo. Ok? So this is how I would speak if I was talking to a group of children and we were getting ready for lunch in this context. And I'm saying it's time to tidy up your table and we're going to get ready for lunch. So maybe you can have a think about, how did that feel in that moment when you were trying to figure out what I was trying to say? What were you focusing on? Was it too fast? Did it feel like just one word because there was no breaks, or was there breaks, pauses? And if you were trying to figure out what I was trying to say, now in this video, you have no other visual cue. So you can only hear me. You don't know exactly if I'm talking to children or about children, if I'm talking about toys or food, if I'm talking about a routine. So basically, from my facial expression, you could see very little, and I spoke quite fast. So maybe you can play it again and have a think about, how did it feel to hear all of that language all together without context. So this was just a very quick and hopefully useful exercise to immerse you in another language for just a few seconds. So if we are looking at the practical aspects of supporting children who are developing more than one language, I know you may be really interested in the very, very specific questions. And I really hope that you'll have questions that you can put in the chat and I'll be able to answer them over the next few weeks. So really, please do use the chat function or the comment function under the video, and also look at other people's questions and the answers to those. But I'll speak first about not only the day-to-day language aspects, but also everything that goes with it, because I'm not going to only focus on specific language tips, but also communication and inclusion. So the first thing to think about is that all children come with their first name. That's one thing that all children have. It's very common to have in a class that is multilingual to have names that you may have never come across before. And parents are often very good at telling you how to pronounce the name, but sometimes, especially if names are very long or if they have sounds that are not common to the English language, parents may already have been quite frustrated, or over the first couple of years, so many people will come to you and say, oh, could you say that name again? Or how is it that you say? Or they say the name completely differently. That sometimes parents say, yes, my child's name is X, but you can call him or her Y, because they already know that it's hard for you. But for children, their name is really, really important. And again, to give you an example from an Irish name, like Siobhan or Aoife, Alva, and so on and so forth. Yes, the pronunciation is an Irish pronunciation, so from the Irish language. It may not match what an English speaker might look at, you know. If you're an English speaker and you don't know the Irish language and you see Aoife, you might pronounce it completely differently. But does it matter? Do you want to be called Aoife or Aoife? So yes, after a while, you might accept that people make mistakes when they say your name, but I think it's really, really important that we start from the name, because it's not only you teaching the child your language or teaching the child to live multilingually in a context where a lot of children speak different languages, but it's also about yourself, putting yourself in that position and stepping into this world where we speak multiple languages. And that also means that we have names that are pronounced differently from the standard English or Irish way. So it is really important that names are pronounced correctly. And there's many ways to go about it. First of all, and this is because the reason why I asked you all these questions earlier, you might say, well, I'm not very good at pronouncing other languages. So we can forget about that, because there isn't very good or not very good. There is a child who has a name, and we can break it down. If at the beginning it seems very long or some of the sounds seem really, really complicated, the parent can help you to break down the name, and you can call the child the name that the parent or the child want to be called. And also have a conversation with the parents about this. It's also very important, the second point here, that you know what languages children and parents speak. And this might seem really, really obvious, but sometimes when we are asking for birth information, health information, and any other information, we may not be looking specifically at what languages people speak. There might be a question in a form at registration time that says, what's your first language, if other than English? And that might not give parents enough space to write all of the languages that the child has been learning or speaking since birth. So it's important to find out and to say to parents that you're asking because you want to make the most of this. Because it might be that some parents feel that it would be better to say that English is the child's first language, rather than further complicating by saying, well, we actually also speak Hindi at home, and also we have a dialect that we speak to the grandparents, and there's another language that we speak every now and again. So parents might just oversimplify, but that won't give you the full picture. So have that conversation with the parents and say, if there's any other language you have at home, include it in the form, or include it, or, even if there's no form, write them down. So you actually know what languages children are familiar with, even if they don't speak them fluently. So since we're working around the area of language and multilingualism, I'm going to speak a little bit about aspects to consider when you're working with children learning a new language, and then also bilingual learners who've been developing the two languages from birth. And both as the types of children are together in the setting. They are different in how they've approached or they've lived through the development of two languages, but both groups or both types of children need to be looked after linguistically and culturally. So it's very important to bear in mind that how you speak is very important, because we're talking about language. And it's quite easy to step in and go, well, you may not understand me, so I'm going to speak with a louder volume, or I'm going to change the pitch. So I'm going to use a strange or unusual pitch. But actually, you don't need to change your pitch. You don't need to shout. So it's important that if you're speaking with a child, any child, that you use your natural pitch and your natural volume. Speaking clearly, you might think, of course, I speak clearly all the time because I speak with children. But when we speak our first language, we don't notice how many phrases we use that might be informal, phrases that are typical Dublin or typical Cork or typical Donegal. And of course, you have to speak in the most natural way, but clearly means, first of all, using maybe high frequency words, not speaking too fast, leaving space between sentences, and also, not slurring your words. So speaking in a way that is understandable. And this helps every child in your setting, not only children who are learning a second language. It's also quite useful for children who may be struggling with language, irrespectively of whether they're first or second language learners. It's important to use full sentences. And this is really, I should have put that as the first point on this slide, because we might naturally think that if we use a shorter sentence, we're understood better. And I put an example here, like, do you need the toilet versus you toilet? So one sentence is a full sentence and it's correct. The second one is not correct. So you might think, or we might think, it's something that we all do at some stage, that in order to simplify and to be clear, we go for the keywords. And we shorten the sentence. Is such a natural thing, because you want to go straight to what's important, to what matters. So using short sentences is great, but not incorrect sentences, because sometimes a full sentence can be a short sentence. But what I showed you here is an example of a correct versus a sentence that is not. So do you need the toilet is an example. It's lunchtime is another example, instead of just saying lunch. So why would you not use the full sentence? Because the full sentence is going to give the child the complete vision of what the message is. While if you only use one word, yes, the word is isolated, so the message is clear, but it also will take longer for the child to figure out that word in context. So that's why it's always better to use full sentences, and you will naturally use your natural pitch, which will focus on the keywords. We already do that, especially in the English language. There is quite a lot of pitch and intonation that children will get used to. The pitch and intonation of English and where you put pauses in English is different from any other language. So the child will need to get used to that. A child who's new to English will need to get used to the pitch, where you put pauses, And by tuning into that, we'll know also what the key words are. It's important to listen and not only to speak, and that's how conversation happens. And listening means also paying attention to whatever the child is saying and praising them for their sentences, for their progress, especially if English is a new language and the child feels that they're not always understood. Showing that you can understand is really valuable, because this itself gives a boost to the child. It's a measure of success. You know, it's again going back to an example from adults. If you are in a country where no one understands you, if you're in a place where no one understands you, and you try out a sentence and someone nods, you feel that you've accomplished your mission. You've sent out a message and the message was understood. So it's really important to spend time listening and responding. Correcting is not ideal because it doesn't speed up the learning, but what it can do is put the child off, because the immediate sensation is, well, I keep getting corrected, so I must not be very good at this. So there are a lot of questions that come up always when we talk about correction, because here we're talking about very young children, and we're also talking about children who are starting to express themselves. So at some point later down the line, correction will be useful for children to be able to pay attention on their errors. But in the early years, in the immersion context, you don't need to correct in the formal way, saying, well, you don't say this, you should say that. What you can do is to use correct and appropriate language and model the sounds and the words for children. So you may be looking at a picture and the child is describing a lion and talking about the lion's hair and the shape of the face and the fang and whatever. And maybe some words are incorrect, or some words are pronounced in a way that deviates from what you're expecting. So what you can do is repeat these sounds and these words together with the child, not asking the child, oh, repeat after me, but you yourself can walk through the picture and describe what you see and point at what you see and model these sounds and these words. Other aspects that are important, that are not necessarily very specific to language learners, is to not isolate children. So why do I say this? It's because sometimes we have this idea that a child needs time on their own to process. And so some children could naturally be drawn to isolate themselves and look for their own time and create their space around them where they feel comfortable. And that's fine. But you can also, observe this behavior and try to provide opportunities where the child feels comfortable in playing and interacting with other children. But don't feel that by intentionally isolating the child because the child needs to process the language, you are doing a good thing for the child. Children can only learn language when they interact. So letting a child find their space is great, but also in every day-to-day kind of setting, there will be some routines that the child is happy to join in for a little while before they go back maybe and do some play on their own. So definitely, and it's not only about the isolation, but it's also about the comment that I often hear, that the child needs to process the language on their own. They need to think, they need space to think. Yes, they need some space to think, but language is something that you develop through interaction. And this is where group work also might be really positive, because by working with other children, children are naturally immersed in the language. And this obviously applies to, as I said in the previous video, this applies to Irish medium settings as well. Anything that I've been saying throughout concerns new learners of Irish, but also immersion settings in Irish, where the immersion in the language is important, the socialization in the language is important, working in groups is important, and also, as you can imagine, it's better to work in groups where you have a range of abilities and not in a group where everybody's new to the language or everybody's really strong in the language. If you can have a context in which children, especially if you're talking about English language learners, they might be in a class where in a setting where other children have strong English language skills, you want these children to work together. You don't want to create a separate group with newcomers who are new to the English language, unless you're doing something specific with them to boost some vocabulary skills or something. But in the day-to-day, play is for everybody to come together. And using language while playing might seem like the most obvious one. So of course, we use language all the time. And that's where children are learning really well because they're not so much maybe paying attention to the fact that they don't understand, because there's so much movement in play, there's so much visuals around play. Ashter would have all of your guidelines around how to play and how to creatively use language to play. Everything is in your Ashter already, which is fantastic. So using language means also pointing at things. It means associating a routine or a role play with specific words or with specific expressions. So even if you think about role play very, very often requires language. If it doesn't require language, it requires some sort of movement, facial expression, routine. So all of this is building on the child's understanding of the communication or developing communication skills and developing language skills. And anything that is visual always helps. And again, if we imagine that we're immersed again as adults in a completely different context where we don't know what is going on, we don't understand the words that people are saying, what are we going to do? We're going to look around us. We're going to follow. If we see a group of people lining up, we might start to line up because that's what's the appropriate thing to do. If we see people leaving the building and there's no one left, we might feel actually what they said is that the building is closing, so I should follow. And so we use anything, we use our eyes to compute and process all the information around us. So any visual information is great. If you have, of course, you'll have pictures, you'll have visuals of different kinds, picture books, anything that is visual also is a piece of information that children are really heavily relying to when they're trying to understand what is being said. So you can use all this information together. You can use your visual information, you can use your gesture, you can use your simple or kind of plain sentences using clear and natural pitch and tone, clear communication, so not slurring or speeding up too much. And all of this together will allow the child to compute all this information that is coming in, which is often quite a lot. In a busy setting, there's a lot of information that is going in, whether it's visual, whether it's social, and children might be quite tired at the end of it, even if they're in this environment for a few hours. The intensity of the learning that is taking place in a novel environment can make children quite tired. And this also links to the questioning. And we might feel that by asking questions, we are promoting learning. And a lot of the time, questioning is really important because it also shows that you want to hear the child's voice. But with second language learners, we might focus very much on tell me what that word is, or how do you call that, or repeat after me, or showing them a picture and says, what do you call this? So for part of the time, this might be a useful exercise if there's a reason or a purpose for it. But it's not a good idea to always be asking questions all the time, like what's this and what do you call this? And it will be possible that at the beginning, a child who's new to English will only want to, or will only say yes and no to your questions. And in a way, if the language is not up to scratch, if you want to use this expression, I don't like it very much, so I shouldn't use it. So the child hasn't fully developed the language and cannot answer your question, the feeling will be of failure. So sometimes you will notice that children are happy to listen and to follow instruction, but they're taking their time before they put sentences together. So actually having constant questioning also makes the child in some cases feel, I can't speak, I don't know how to answer this question, rather than feeling, I understand a lot about what's going on and it's great because I can interact and I can play. So yes, interaction is important, but not regular, constant, I suppose, questioning. And so any kind of interaction is part of communication, and it is helping you to build a relationship with the child. And sometimes it's not asking the question, what's this? Sometimes it's following the child's lead to focus on something that the child is interested in, or a game that they're playing that they're really fascinated by. And maybe, using the visual aspects. And I'm looking down because I'm sort of imagining playing with blocks or doing a puzzle. A lot of play is nonverbal. And so, but this can still embed some interaction, especially if you have the time and the possibility to have some one-to-one interaction, or a little bit of time dedicated to spending time with the child, who may not immediately tell you what they think or what they're doing, but they are still in need of some sort of exchange. So some language is important, even if we can do a lot of nonverbal play. Language takes time to develop, but some key sentences can be taught at the beginning, or whenever you feel that the child is ready, that they might feel comfortable in the environment, they're relaxed, and so they're ready to learn a few phrases that you do use on a regular basis. So some key phrases, for example, phrases concerning routines, food, toilet, or changing clothes, or spending time outside, and or key phrases like "don't worry" or "well done" can be taught in a formal way. So sometimes there are some visuals that you can even find online that show you the sentence, and then beside it there's a smiley face, or there's a frown, or just either smileys or actual pictures with facial expressions can be useful to refer to feelings. Others can be pictures and associated with phrases around routines, and so these can be repeated in a formulaic way. And in the previous video I talked about the importance of sentences that are repeated as formula, because they come back always in the same format, like tidy up time. So something like tidy up time is a sentence that you repeat probably on a daily basis, always in the same way. So children associate it with an action or a routine. So other phrases such as that can be repeated as chunks, as formulas, so that, especially if they're really important, the child can compute them faster. And then they hear natural language for the rest of the day. The other really important point is to be able to say a few words in the child's mother tongue. And here you're thinking, well, I have 12 different languages in my group. How am I going to learn all of these languages? So some of the key phrases might be the top 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 sentences that you have chosen that you feel are really important to communicate with the child. You can translate them with the parents' help. In some cases, you might want to use Google Translate or other translation tools. And also through Google Translate, for example, you can click on the audio icon and you can hear how it's being pronounced. And the child might lead you on that. So having some key vocabulary or some key phrases in the child's mother tongue will also help you to get the key messages across, especially around very, very important routines. And even though we're focusing on language, as I said earlier, language is a lot more than just the words and the phrases. There's a lot of nonverbal language and nonverbal play taking place, which is helping the child to settle. And when they, it's very difficult to learn if you're struggling socially and emotionally, and language is no different. So if you are creating an environment, and we'll speak a little bit more about this in the next video, but if you're creating an environment that is welcoming to all languages and cultures, where children feel that they have fun playing, they can express themselves non-verbally, and they can be to some extent understood, children will feel more comfortable than trying to speak. If you're not correcting, children will feel comfortable making mistakes. If every child in the group is accustomed to the fact that some children are difficult to understand because they're new to the language, but every one of us has a role to play, and everyone in the group is going to have to make an effort to try and understand each other, you're creating together a place where children, it's a place where well-being is valued, where children feel safe to share. And that's where languages can flourish. It's where children can feel that they can express themselves. So every piece of your daily routine, every moment for play and interaction, even without language, can help the child who is new, who is feeling maybe lonely and that they don't belong. All of this can help the child feel that they belong to this group of children and that they are starting to communicate. And slowly language will also become part of this communication. So I know that quite a lot of the focus in this video was around finding solutions, I suppose, to solve the challenges that we often have when we want to teach a second language, even though we're not second language teachers. I think it's also important that we focus on children who are bilingual. And with bilingual here, I mean the children are second language learning. We would call them emergent bilinguals, so they're developing a new language. But there are a lot of other children who are the invisible bilinguals, who are often the children who've been bilingual from birth. Why are they invisible? Because they come into the setting and their English is the same as everyone else. And we're not worried about them, because we're not immediately concerned, as much as we may be, about the child who is not able to communicate. So often we go into the emergency mode. So we know that there's a challenge, there's a child who we want to support because we want them to flourish and communicate and interact. And that's why at the start I focused on this child. But there's also another child in the setting. And that's the child who has 2 or more languages, who knows about 2 or more cultures. And those languages and cultures are really important in this child's identity. In the next video, I will talk a little bit more about how we can create environments that foster all languages and all levels of, or all types of bilinguals, but also to focus on the fact that every child will benefit from this, that not only bilingual or multilingual children.